Yeah, family law, the only branch of our legal system where there's no presumption of innocence. Murderers, rapists, terrorists, pedophiles all get more legal rights than law-abiding citizens. And the silver bullet, as I call it, the silver bullet playbook or paradigm of high conflict divorce, the smoking gun of this corrupt legal system, that's become the go-to strategy for divorce lawyers, that guarantees victory, and they encourage the petitioners and the respondents to use, usually petitioners, to utilize this strategy, usually the false allegation of domestic violence, to win in court, to get the cash and prizes, for want of a better phrase. And you know, when I had no idea of the words family law before what happened to me in 2015. And once I started investigating through experience and through talking with other experts in the system, outside the system, it became clear to me that we have a real issue here. And if we can improve or reform the family court or the family law system, expose the cartel of family law, as I call it, because it is like a crime syndicate, these quasi-kangaroo courts that they have, you don't get the presumption of innocence. You don't get your rights read to you. I've spoken with fathers in particular who've been ended up in court with false allegations of domestic violence. One told me a story about he put his wrists up and said, "Your Honor, arrest me. Have the bailiff arrest me." And the judge said, "Are you crazy?" And the gentleman said, "No, if I'm arrested, I'll get the rights that a criminal has, Miranda rights, access to an attorney, etc., etc." And of course, those who are suffering the most are the people who don't have the wherewithal or the financial resources to be able to have representation. And even those who do, if you are the respondent, you are behind the curve. It is the presumption is that you as the accused have to prove your innocence, rather than the accused, which is Western jurisprudence, has to prove their case. And so I think
it seems like in our society, in a lot of strange ways, the accuser now seems to have almost an untrammeled right to be believed. And and online too, you can be accused of virtually anything and then mobbed for virtually anything. And it's virtually impossible to defend yourself. And this notion that merely because someone says they've been offended, let's say, in the mildest of cases, that means you have definitively done something wrong there's a pervasive and broad-scale move in that direction in our culture. So what happened in your case? You were the respondent in a divorce case, which you didn't see coming. That's correct? I read your book. It was a while back, so I'm pulling all the bits of it back into my memory. But let's go through the story exactly.
Sure, and just very briefly to that point, yes, victimhood has become the new social currency. Its economy is booming, and where victimhood is rewarded, responsibility never follows. So it's part of the reason I call the book The Respondent. It's the defendant in a family law case, and the petitioner is that person who actually instigates the proceedings. So what happened to me in the span of, I'd say, around 8 hours. I'd been married for 20 years, 2 children, 2 boys, the meaning of my life. We did everything together. I was that engaged, loving, present father. Family was my everything. And,
how old were your boys at that point?
10 years old and 8 years old at the time.
Okay, and you said you've had quite a stellar career, and obviously we're very busy doing that. So in what sense was your family at the center of your life?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think my now ex-wife and I we drifted somewhat to become a well-oiled marriage machine. The avoidant in her and the anxious in me couldn't quite get close enough. I think Pia Melody calls it the co-addicted love tango, where we were kind of swaying back and forth, trying to get closer, but drifting apart. I would be out of town filming a movie and return, and she'd go out of town because she wanted to work, and I supported that. I would have preferred she stayed home, but she wanted to work. So I was like, great. So we worked our schedules out that we could be present. And much of my work was in town in Hollywood. at one of the studios. Yeah, well, look, in the span of 8 hours, I was ushered from my home in handcuffs at the behest I later discovered of my ex-wife. I was committed to a mental institution against my will, the first of 5 incarcerations. There was also an incarceration in I called it solitary confinement, but it was a singular jail cell, subjected to a temporary restraining order in divorce court on the basis of a false allegation that eventually was disproven some 6 months later. But by then, of course, the reputation savaging had been done, and it was all over by the shouting. I became homeless and almost destitute overnight, and lost my professional reputation. I wouldn't say it was irretrievably destroyed, but in the small, close-knit community that I lived in Hollywood, close to the studios, it certainly took a big dent. And
everybody lives in a small, close-knit community like that if they're working. I mean, the immediate people that you are in contact with and working with intensely tends to be quite a small number. And it's quite interesting when you get tarred and feathered. The people around you get afraid of the contamination real quickly, and that's partly because they look at what happened to you, and then they also think, well, we don't really know what went on in the marriage, and people are capable of terrible things, and maybe there were things that we don't know about, and then they're split because they knew you and your wife, and so it gets complicated instantly. And then it's easier for people just not to have that much to do with you because they also have choices, right? Because they know a reasonable number of people. And it's then maybe you fall from number 1 or number 2 on their list of people to invite to like number 15, and they only ever invite the top 10. And so people don't even have to turn their backs on you that much in order for you to be, friendless. And so these and the allegation, what exactly was the allegation, and why do you think that your wife felt compelled to make it? And how do you think she rationalized that to herself if it wasn't true?
That's a great question. She had been diagnosed with panic disorder. She wasn't taking her medication. She was out of town. And she had called the police on this particular day, March 5th, 2015, and she'd asked them to come to the house. I'd actually taken the afternoon off. I was at home with my sons playing in the playroom with them. And she asked them to come to the house and said that I was confused. And the dispatch said, we can't go to the house if he's confused. She said, well, what do you need to hear? And they said, we need to hear he's a threat to himself or the children. And then allegedly sometime later, I think 45 seconds later, she called them back and said, my husband's just told me, quote, I'm sick of this shit. I'm gonna harm the children, end quote. And those 10 words, that 10-word lie was the basis of law enforcement coming. First, it was 2 to my front door. Then it was 3. Then it was 5 and a sergeant, and the massing garrison, the threshold of my home. Without cause, without a warrant, my rights were trampled. The police entered. A SMART team from the DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services, came in. I was shackled in handcuffs with a bar behind my back in a quite affluent neighborhood with the curtains wide open on a Thursday evening.
Right. Well, that'll be a little hard on your reputation, all right.
Won't it?
Yeah, I would say so.
And then, of
what
course,
are people going to think? Or what are they going to think? They're going to think the whole police system is corrupt and that this is all made out of nothing and he's actually innocent. It's like, it's pretty damn hard for people to jump to that conclusion instantly. Yeah, that's rough.
Of course, what then happened was, I was kind of bundled into the back of an unmarked police car and raced off into the middle. One of the most heartbreaking images I remember was looking up from the back of that police car and seeing my son, my eldest boy, Charlie, at the window. Live. And, Jordan,
that's rough, man.
Seeing my son's childhood at 10 was over. I knew what was coming: spousification, adultification, the vilification and the erasure of me as a man, as a father, as a patriarch, as a provider. And I was also heading into a terrifying unknown, a dystopian odyssey. I talk about it as if it's some kind of Kafka trap, but it certainly was Kafkaesque. And then, of course, the word on the street. I mean, some of the stories I later heard back were absolutely insane. I mean, he's armed, he's psychotic, she was telling everyone that I was psychotic and I was bipolar. All of these messages came through, that my children as well, when I eventually got to see them. And there was no end in sight. It was just down the rabbit hole we go. And of course, I thought I would get justice. Naively,
the justice system is mostly there to stop people who can't reconcile their differences from wreaking social havoc. That's basically what it's there for. Do you think you're going to go to the justice system and get justice? It's like you'll be lucky if it doesn't destroy you once you're tangled up in it. So
it nearly did. It nearly destroyed me.
I'm amazed it didn't. It's amazing that it didn't, and that you managed to get through this. And so, okay, so this happened, and then you're off to the police station. And the thing is, the police are going to view themselves in a situation like that as white knights, right? Because they've come in, and you can understand that. They've come in at the behest of a woman, and God only knows how abused she's been, because women do get abused, and that's for sure. And so, and of course, the guilty act innocent, just like the innocent act innocent, probably the guilty are even better at it. And so, and then you're going to be viewed with suspicion, because men are going to be viewed with suspicion in a situation like this, for sure, where there's allegations of abuse. And that's because there are a handful of bad men, and then bad impulses in all of us that, that can be dragged out one way or another. And so, okay, so why did your wife double down on it, do you think?
I think there are probably a few possible reasons. One, I think, is shame. The emotion, or, we talk psychology, it's an extremely powerful emotion. And I think once she'd let Pandora out of the box, if you will, I think the only thing left was hope. And it was hope for her existence. I think there was fear and panic that instilled in herself about that suddenly, after 20 years of living a great life together and building a great life and a great home and a great family, which is, is so important, is my primary reason for being, that she perhaps was unaware somewhat of the system and how the system comes in and forces, when I found out that the states get reimbursed $6,000 for every child that they place into foster care, and 4,000 children a day lose a parent in family law, there are financial incentives in place. And the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1974 offers financial incentives to the states that increase these foster or adoption numbers. And to receive these incentives and bonuses, local child protection services must have more children. They must have more, quote, merchandise to sell. Funding is available when a child is placed in a foster home with strangers, or placed in a mental health facility, or medicated, as it's called, usually against the parents' wishes. So I think she was also her family system of origin, her mother, Appalachian woman, a very proud woman, twice married, twice divorced. She came in strong, moved into the family home straight away the same night. She actually got to the family home before my ex-wife returned when I was incarcerated. And it was that psychological kind of hammering home that you need to do this, you need to do that. And when the CPS came in and said, you need to start divorce proceedings. You need to file for divorce. You need to file for a restraining order. Otherwise, your children will go into foster care. That threat, I'm sure, must have been terrifying for her as well. So having opened the
Why did they
Pandora's
threaten
box,
her specifically? That was the Child Protection Services. Why did they threaten her with having the children go into foster care? Was it because she was hypothetically unable to protect them from you if she didn't take certain actions? What was the reason?
It's my understanding that this is what they do. This is the modus operandi of the CPS, because they need to, like traffic wardens, need to have enough tickets. The CPS need to make me to quota.
God help you if you ever get tangled up with Child Protective Services.
Jordan, I got a few months later, I managed to get the report that the CPS, this woman, this social worker for the CPS who came in and ruined, played a large part in ruining my family with the system and removing my sons
social
from having
worker
a father.
training is corrupt beyond belief too. It's politically correct right to the bloody roots, and so the many social workers will come into a situation with that, like that, armed to the teeth with the presumption that the whole system is a patriarchal, oppressive system. It's based on the exploitation of women and children, and they just need the tiniest bit of evidence to make sure that you're one of those patriarchal oppressors who they're going to take care of.
Right.
And so that's drummed into them like mad right from day one in social work training. And increasingly, social work as a profession is completely permeated by ideologues of exactly that type. It's God help you if you fall into their hands.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I've learned this through my experience. And look, my sons they led a privileged life. It was an earned privileged life. I had to work hard to get out of my small little town in England and, go to London. And, I don't want to get into the whole earned and unearned privilege, but that's why I'm a believer in just the same as offense isn't given, it's only taken. If you choose to take it, go ahead.
Look, we all have our privileges and our disadvantages. And, and some of them are earned and some of them aren't earned. And hopefully we pay for the ones that aren't earned by trying to be good people and by taking the responsibility of that unearned privilege forward. But it's only a fool and an ideologue who goes after someone for their unearned privilege, because the same question can be asked very quickly and very effectively precisely of them. I went to this Hollywood, I don't know what to call it, meeting on someone's lawn once, where everyone there was talking about the 1%. And this was in like Beverly Hills. And it was on the lawn in a mansion. And I thought, well, I got up and said, you people might not be in the 1% by North American standards, because you don't have $100 million, but you're in the 1% by global and historical standards. It's like, so who the hell exactly are we talking about here with this unearned privilege nonsense? So a little of that goes a long ways too. Yep.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I was going to quickly say, my sons, they led a privileged existence, but they were connected to their mother and their father, their biological mother and biological father. We had a family unit, and to see, I'm a member of the country club, and I would take them golfing every Sunday, and at least family dinner, because we were both out working, but that was my thing. We come together as a family, if we can, every day, and definitely on Sunday for the traditional roast dinner that we do in England. And then to read that report, Jordan, 4 months later, after I'd been in the fire, a 53-page report from the DCFS and the social worker, I wept. I wept as I read, the questions asked to my sons. Has Daddy ever touched your penis? Has he ever put a needle in your arm? I mean, the questions
Jesus
that my
Christ.
sons were just, and I was still
Well, you
removed.
think about what questions like that do to kids. It's like, first of all, you're telling the kids that there are adults that do this to children. So that's the first thing you're doing with the questions. And that's a bit of a revelation to the average child who's, say, 8 or 10, who's really not been privy to such treatment. So you're confronting them with the idea of malevolence itself.
Correct.
And you're a stranger, and you're asking them these weird questions about like deep malevolence. And so what's up with the institutions, you might say? And then you're implying that their father did this. And if you're the typical social worker trained in this sort of nonsense, there's the kind of insinuation that goes along with that that's likely to produce nightmares in the children and phobia. Yes. And there's a big documented literature on that. It's like what do they call that? It's the false memory syndrome, essentially. That's like right. If you get into the hands of a bad therapist and they start poking around in your memory structure, or they can elicit stories from children. There's great documentation of all the daycare. Remember the satanic abuse scandals in the 1980s? Yes. My God, You read about what the social worker types and police too, what they did to children by asking them these leading questions. It's just absolutely pathological. And then you'd get kids coming up with these fantasies about what happened that were just, well, and then egged on by the police and the social workers until there was a satanic nightmare at the bottom of it, and none of it ever happened. It's
one of the proudest
unbelievable.
moments I have of my sons at 8 and 10, getting to page 51 or 52 in that report, and they were asked about me as a father and how they rated me, having rated their mother, and it was A+++. They could so easily, to your point, have been led down the psychological garden path to arrive at answers that were just fantasies and not real. But that lasting impression that was left on them, one of the saddest. I was forced to visit with my sons, which the very notion of. I remember one father in family court who was told by a judge, visitation, and he said, "I will never visit my children. They are my children." And he turned and walked out. And I'll never forget that. I remember looking back years down the line at visitation, where that led, because the visitation monitor happened to be, he had 7 AKAs, used to be a woman, had a criminal record, and he drove around in, a car with stickers of guns and NRA, and not that that's an issue, but just it all added up, and there was nothing I could do, and I was getting blackmailed, and there was no one I could go to. He was the only conduit. And then I found out that
he was there to supervise your visits.
Right, to basically let, by presence, let my sons know that I was dangerous to be around or to be feared, which I never had been. And every piece of documentation in the visitation reports, at least for the first 18 months, was, "We love you, Dad. We want to live with you, Dad. Can't we see you and Mom? Why is Mom doing this?" The first visit was, "Dad, Mom says to not get in the car with you because you're going to kidnap us and you have bipolar." I mean, these kinds of things were just harrowing to me to hear, but there wasn't really any. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing there's no one to speak to. But my 8-year-old, I remember one visit. I think it was maybe my second visit. My 8-year-old not only had suicidal ideations, at 8 years old, my beautiful, innocent, playful lad, and he talked out loud about how he was going to kill himself. And I had to listen to that as this monitor listened to it and didn't even consider it a critical incident to report it. And anyway, who's he going to report it to, and what are they going to do? They'd have probably said,
"That's just more proof of your guilt."
There you go.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely.
So this is why, Jordan, I came back like a phoenix from the flames. I was dead and buried. I mean, I literally got to that edge of existential terror. And
that's a long way out there, that edge.
Whoa. Have you visited?
Yeah, I've been there for quite a while. Yeah. For about 2 years. So.
I feel for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested, we could talk more about my story, but I'm interested on how we teeter on that long edge, how we
I was fortunate
ride the waves.
I was fortunate, maybe in contrast to your situation, because what happened to me didn't happen in a manner that severed my closest intimate relationships. They were still intact. And so when I got very ill and was also being attacked constantly, my friends and my family were like rocks. And so thank God for that. But so I didn't lose that. And, I don't think I would have lived if I would have lost that too. And so.
Yeah, I remember talking, Michaela came on my show, the respondent, and we talked about, that whole situation. I was moved to tears, the podcast you did with her when you came back, and just your struggle and what you've given to society and humanity. And the outrageous attacks from cowards who are, the cowards think they have courage, and they're placed on the pedestals of social media, and they're not. And with what happened to me and my boys, that led me on a journey. I guess the big pinnacle moment for me, and I didn't read that much at school. I only read scripts as I went through my career, whether it be screenplays or doing voiceovers. It was 2016. I went right to the edge, and I came back from the edge, and I don't know where this came from, but I asked myself the meaningful question, who am I? And I opened up my iPhone and I did a deep dive dialectical of meaningful question and meaningful answer of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And I got over 1,000 answers and questions. I still have them. And that led me through to learn a little about philosophy, phenomenology, affect theory, and just epistemology in general, and how I could ritualize my way back to be on my feet again, because I was fetal. I think my parasympathetic nervous system was just shaking, and the blinds were closed. I couldn't see or hear another human being because there was probably going to be a child laughing, which would remind me of the devastation of losing my sons, the meaning of my life. And so I had to really get in that deep conversation with self, me, self, and the third eye of perception, and really get the walking going again and the talking going again, and trying to get more precise with the words I was thinking and expressing, and rebuild and reform and restore, not the same life. I say, we have two lives, and the second life begins the moment we realize we have only one. But that new chapter, that new episode, and how to self-author, if you will, life is remembered backwards and lived forwards. Well, how can I redraft that floppy disk in my mind, if you will, or outside?
Why did you decide to bother, do you think? I mean,
It was for a while, for a long while, but under the unrelenting inescapability of the trauma. Trauma resides in the body, and the body keeps the score. And going through this, I could see the trauma that was being enacted on them, their loss, their grief, their living grief. I talk about suicide by living grief. Some of the fathers, many fathers, some mothers too, who are no longer with us because of that suicide by living grief. The inescapability that there isn't a finality to the grief. There isn't a finality to the mourning process, to be able to memorialize and lay to rest. That last chapter of my book, I think it's chapter 17, A Funeral for My Sons, was I had to find some way to make meaning in that moment, to lay to rest the childhoods that had been stolen from them, and that sense of fatherhood and being that father to them. So that was, and then of course I had to find a way to sense make through this, and find a way to help and give back. I think, there was part of me that throughout my career had always been, what can I get? What role can I get? And we're always living to the next projected moment of, if you're on tour, I'm playing this venue. Can I get to a bigger venue next year? Can I play to more people, make more money? And that's the continuing cycle of projecting into the next moment, not living in the now moment. And that's what can I get? And where I moved to was, what can I give? How can I give? He who has a why can bear any how. Well, I got to the how. And for me, it was working through some kind of story within my own story, which made it more traumatic, because even writing the book, I hadn't really authored a book before. So I was having to revisit the trauma of the experience and then read the audiobook and talk about it. So it's this perpetual cycle, but fueling being able to help people. Being able to, at least when it happened to me, Jordan, I looked online, I was the black sheep looking online for some kind of help and hope. And the only thing available were 1-800 numbers for attorneys and law firms in family law to make money, and books written by women for women on how to ruin your husband and get the cash and prizes, the silver bullets. The only book I found was Alec Baldwin's book, A Promise to Ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I could only get 15 pages into that because he emailed me and said, this is the best I can offer right now, read my book. His is literally, it starts in the star chamber of family law. Whereas my story, as you know, it kind of, that's the second, it's in 3 parts. Part 1 is fear, part 2 is loathing, part 3 is redemption. And it moves into the second part, into the system and the systematic, institutionalized bias of how courts perceive, how individuals within the court system, judges, child psychologists, perceive men and fathers, and the family unit, and this, the neo-feminist kind of radical fourth wave feminism that devalues the patriarchy. I don't want to go too down that discussion.
Yeah, but it's worth. If the idea that marriage itself is a patriarchal and oppressive institution isn't far removed from the idea that the nuclear family, especially a two-parent nuclear family, is not to be preferred, say, over a one-parent nuclear family. So what the hell difference does it make if you break one up? And how do you know the father isn't just an oppressive, what would you say, exploiter? Because that goes along with the entire rest of your philosophy. And then you might say, well, that's just philosophy. Who cares? It's like, yeah, you wait till it gets a hold of your leg. You'll find out who cares real soon, because it's going to be you. And you think that's not philosophy. It's like, you're going to find out real different, real soon, and you're not going to like a bit of it.
Yeah, too true. And when I looked into the stats, when I found out that the world leader in children growing up in single-parent households was America, when I found out that 43% of American children live without their father, 63% of youth suicides from dad-deprived homes. I know you've had Dr. Warren Farrell on your show talking about this dad deprivation.
The noted men's right fascist.
Yes,
the guy who used to be on the National Organization of Women. And he's a real fascist, old Warren Farrell.
But it's like, where have all the mentors gone? Well, it's no surprise we don't have many men, or as many men stepping in. Well, we're okay sending them off to war, but in terms of like stepping into the public conversation, because patriarchy, because smash 'em, because believe all. We should listen, yes, but believe all women? No. Time's up, good riddance. Glad they're gone, done. We look at organizations like, once great storied organizations like the ACLU.
Yeah.
Gone, done, over. Can't be trusted.
Then there's the Southern Poverty Law Center. They're lots of fun too. Yeah.
Aren't they? They're just a barrel of laughs.
Yeah, they are. They're just a blast, those people.
I mean, look, when we have an industry, going back to family law, when we have a nearly $60 billion a year American divorce machine, that's what the cartel makes, $60 billion. It's not incentivized to reform itself.
The whole divorce industry can feast on the accumulated wealth of a once stable family. And so
that's right.
Obviously, it's going to produce a tremendous amount of parasitic activity. Now, that leads us to a deeper question here, too, is, look, many of the people in my immediate family have been divorced. And so, I don't ask such questions lightly, but we did have a notion in our society for a very, very long time that divorce was wrong. And as I said, many people in my family have been divorced, and they had difficulty in their marriages, and sometimes they established much more satisfactory, let's say, second marriages. But it isn't obvious to me at all that liberalizing the divorce statutes, especially in relationship to no-fault divorce, which was supposed to be, an easy pathway forward, has produced anything but an absolute carnage in its wake. And so obviously, having lived through these problems, you're very much inclined and motivated to find solutions. And what do you think of in relationship to solutions? I mean, I didn't believe this when I was younger, but I think 50-50 custody should be the default in every divorce case, and that both parties should have to argue against that, rather than the presumption being that the children, especially when young, are better off with their mother. And I don't say that lightly, because I know that particularly for children under 9 months old, that maternal care is really primary. But the fact that the default position is custody with the mother puts men in an unbelievably bad situation. And the children as well.
I couldn't agree with you more on 50-50 default shared parenting. There have been 2 states who've passed it, Kentucky and Arkansas. Kentucky, interestingly enough, they passed 50-50 shared parenting in a large part because I believe it's illegal for the legal industry to lobby politicians there. And that's the challenge, is that when you have such a huge, very wealthy lobbying group, the state bar associations, who write their own family law codes in the Wild West of family law. They write the codes and they spend money at the last couple of weeks before, a bill has dropped, and they lie and they skew the statistics and people believe them and bills don't pass. But Kentucky did pass. Arkansas passed. I'm really excited to say.
When was that?
That was I believe Kentucky was 2019. Arkansas was more recent, but I literally just heard a week ago that Representative Rodney Creech in Ohio, this is a bipartisan bill. Normally these bills, when they're put through, they usually have about 10 to 15 co-sponsors. We now on that bill, I think we have 68 co-sponsors for an equal shared parenting bill in Ohio. So this is fantastic news for Ohioans, for families, for parents, and for children. I think if we can improve the system, and at least through 50-50 shared parenting, we can ease the burden on the mental health system, the physical health system, incarceration rates, dropouts from school, drug rates, child porn addiction, online porn addiction.
One of the stunning issues of our time, I would say, is that the statistics that 2-parent families are better for children are absolutely overwhelming.
Yep.
And so it's quite the mystery that it's ignored. And I think part of the reason that fact is ignored is because of this pervasive anti-patriarchal philosophy, let's call it that because that particular fact sticks so badly in the craw of that philosophy that it has to be ignored. And so,
yes.
But then you ask yourself, well, who are we for here? Are we for the kids or for the adults? Because if we were for the kids, we'd be pushing 2-parent families. And then that's rough too, because if you say 2-parent families are optimal, let's say, you're faced with the necessity in some sense of having to discriminate against 1-parent families, because if 2 is better, then 1 is worse. And, then you point to the single mother struggling valiantly against all odds to do a credible job with her kids. And it's not like people like that don't exist. And then you're such a son of a bitch for daring to compare her horrible struggle to what's optimal. But, what's the alternative?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And I think, given the way the system of government is set up, it's very challenging. The system has got so big that we almost need to blow it up and start again. I think,
there's no shortage of people working on that at the moment. Not so much to start it again, but definitely to blow it all up.
Yeah, but in terms of improvements for family law, I think, look, I'd mentioned the presumption of innocence, jurisprudence. I talked with Professor Robbie McCormick on my show, and we talked about jurisprudence and family law and the burden of proof that must be on the accuser and not the accused. We're in family law, we're in the Salem witch trials, we're in the Spanish Inquisition. 50-50 shared parenting, obviously, a divorce must start with the default presumption that what is in the best interests of the children is for both parents to equally share in the parenting. We saw with Brad Pitt's divorce from Angie Jolie and the silver bullet that was used against him. And then he worked tirelessly through the retired judge and he won a victory, quote unquote, of 50-50 shared parenting. That should have been the default starting position. I think false allegations of DV is something domestic violence.
Let me push back on that a moment, okay? Because this is what stopped me for years in relationship to, I suppose it was some intrinsic sympathy for the mother-infant bond and some realization that the maternal role is particularly important in the earliest years of childhood development. So what do you do with infants exactly? Do you go for 50-50 custody there as well, and then hope that the men have enough sense to what exactly? It's pretty hard to find a substitute for a breastfeeding mother, Now, lots of breastfeeding mothers go back to work, and so obviously that can be negotiated. And maybe the issue is that it should be 50-50 regardless of the age of the child. What do men do then when they have, custody of a of a 6-month-old infant? That's a real tough question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I hadn't actually thought about that. Brad and Angie's situation, they didn't have infants, but obviously case by case. But the point being that it starts from the 50-50, and then immediately there can be an order if there is an infant that mother has, primary custody 99% of the time, or whatever that might be.
So it's, you think it should be negotiated away from the 50-50 baseline.
Exactly.
So there's two things you'd really like to see change. One is the notion of the presumption of innocence has to be brought within the rubric of the family courts and implemented stringently and efficiently. And the second is we start from the default proposition that it's 50-50 split. What happened to your assets? Let's talk about that. So you had, well, we know that your career was terribly disrupted, but you'd built up, I would presume, a reasonable degree of wealth by that point. And so what happened on that front?
So initially what happened when I was removed from my home on March 5th and incarcerated, the first visit from my ex-wife and her mother, they arrived with no compassion. They basically slapped pieces of paper down and pens and said, write down the usernames and passwords for all of the financial institutions and the bank accounts. And I trusted. And
this was, you were in custody?
Yes. Yeah,
oh, that must have been a fun.
Custody.
So what in the world were you thinking when that was happening? I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, I was incoherent. I was dealing with the terror of being incarcerated and law enforcement and something I wasn't used to. And hoping that they were going to help and that they needed it to do things and pay bills and whatnot. And then I find out afterwards the accounts got siphoned. Checks were being, corporate checks were being, my signature was being forged. And, but family law, all of this evidence didn't seem to matter. So basically the acquired wealth from the bank accounts and the brokerage accounts was just disappearing. I find out later. And then the claim is made that the house, the family residence was not mine and was hers. And when we met, I think it's fair to say that my career was in a better position and I brought more financially to the place, to the start of the marriage. But the notion that she nearly won on that as well, just would have been devastating. I don't know if I'd be here speaking with you if I'd lost on that point. But
why that one particularly?
Because the accumulated, I've been buying and selling properties since I was 17 and started out as an actor in London. So the wealth that I'd accumulated was in the house. It was an expensive house. And so the sale of that house there wasn't very much, there was a tiny mortgage left on it. So that was really I put everything into that house because I'm old school. I believe, you own, I don't want to owe money to people. In America, I do this whole credit system of, you have to get credit. You have to get credit. Where I come from, it's like, no, if you want something, you buy it and you own it. And that's what I wanted to have with the house.
So you put all the eggs in that particular basket. And so, and that wasn't taken away from you completely.
Not
Why
completely.
Not? Why not?
Because, the title to the house was in my name and her name. And as much as she presented in court that it was her house and I wasn't untitled, that piece of evidence was pretty crystal clear. She couldn't steal that.
And was that part of the basis for your ability to rebuild your security, let's say?
Yes. I mean, I was homeless for a while. I was homeless for a good few months, but for the kindness of a few friends who gave me sofas and floors to sleep on. And
why did they do that? Why do you think they trusted you, given everything that had collapsed around you and all the calumny that had been heaped on your name? And why those particular people, do you think?
Well, that's an insightful question. That just makes me. I look to what are the commonalities between those individuals. They were all men. There was one woman, so not all men, most of them men, and they'd all been through divorces.
I see. So okay. So they had
but they
some
knew the
sense
character. They knew. Like there was one gentleman, I mentioned him in the book, Adam Fogelson, who was the chairman of Universal Studios. He knew who I was. His eldest daughter and my son were in pre-kindergarten together. I taught his daughter how to sing and play piano and songwrite, and so he knew that even though I was public enemy number one on the streets and I was being vilified, he didn't believe it. His integrity was so strong that when the second time, when I finally got released or discharged, he had actually employed a security team, top-notch security team, to track the police scanners, because he knew I was going to come up for air. And of course, I did at the neighbor's house. And then that was when there was a team of, I think, 10 police. This was the second time, 5 days later, where they just banged on the door, and I opened the door and they dragged me out and handcuffed me again. And I got dressed down by the sergeant, and this gentleman just kind of stepped out from the shadows and had a word with the sergeant, and kind of I got unhandcuffed, and I walked into what I thought, Jordan, I thought it was homelessness. And he said, "Come with me. Someone's been looking out for you." And he walked me to Adam and Hillary Fogelson's house. And
so you did have some relationships there that withstood the test of time. You can imagine what would happen if you lost that too, man. So I had this client. His wife he was a good guy, hyper conscientious, professional, and his wife she nailed him with accusations of abuse, and she was very attractive and charming and very manipulative and malevolent, and white knights were riding to her aid all the time, and he wanted to get 50-50 custody of his kids, and she first of all, with the allegations of abuse, destroyed his professional reputation, so that means he lost all his clients in his profession, and then she accused him of hiding the money because he was having a hard time making alimony payments, because he couldn't make any money because his profession had been ruined. And so then he set himself up again, providing health care to basically indigenous people on social services. And then he made a go of that. And then she accused him again in court of having money that he was drawing on. So they froze his bank accounts and garnished his wages. And so that made it very difficult for anybody to hire him. And then they could take away, he had to drive to work because he could no longer work close to where he lived. And then they took away his driver's license because they can do that without court in Canada. And so then he couldn't drive. And then they took away his passport because they could do that too. And so in the meantime, to take him through court to siphon the last penny out of him and deny him access to his children. And I went out with him and his children several times, and they were all, 2, 3, and 5, I think, 3 boys. We went out to the science museum, which is a challenging thing to do with 3 young kids. And he showed up on time on the van, and he walked those kids through that science museum, and they just had a wonderful time. And I watched him like a hawk, and he was a really good father. And she, pursuing him, her father mortgaged their house, and she spent all their money, at which they deserved very nicely because they had raised her to be just exactly the way she was. And it was just a bloody disaster. I worked with him for like 3 years trying to help him negotiate through this without dying, just because he wanted his kids. And I pulled out every stop to strategize, and we were careful, and he did what we negotiated, and he was really dedicated to his kids, and he just got ground up, man. And then all this stuff blew up around me and around that time, and I had stopped
story.
What
you talk about right there, I think I heard you mention that maybe a few years ago. That particular story, it may have been that one when you were in practice, but. That speaks to there is no escape. It's the zero-sum game of family law, and it is a game to these attorneys. And it's not just no escape for me as a respondent. It's no escape for the petitioner too, like with Johnny Depp and his situation, right? So, the false allegation of domestic violence. We need to remind people Johnny Depp has not only not been found guilty of any crime, he's not been accused of any crime. He's been tried and found guilty in the court of public opinion, guilty till proven more guilty. And I think it's those kinds of that inability to escape the divorce trap. There's no trap door. There's no way out for both parties. And my ex-wife spent 1.8, I believe it's $1.8 million on an attorney, her attorney, Judy Bogan. And then after 4 years, this attorney just filed to the court to be released from the case. And I believe is now suing my ex-wife for $450,000 on top of that. So the blatant plundering of an estate, and how someone you've worked your whole life, you've started from not a lot, and you've plowed your field in your career. And the notion that just because you have a marriage contract, because, I believe in monogamy, I believe in family, obviously. I made some missteps along the way. I mentioned those in the book. I was, flawed. One thing I wasn't was I was a great dad. I will shout that to the rooftops. I was a brilliant father. My sons loved me and I loved them. So if it could happen to me, and it can happen to Johnny Depp, Brad Pitt. It can happen. It's happening, and it has happened for decades from my research to so many people. And there's a voiceless, growing group of people who've had enough.
Well, the guys that it really happened to, you don't even hear from them. They're so done, man. Some of them are just dead, and the ones that aren't dead, they're done.